I say my boy, and I mean it in every sense that actually matters. Blood is just plumbing. Love is the architecture. And if you think you've already worked out where this story is heading, I can promise you with absolute certainty that you have not. Because the 13 years I spent raising a child the world had written off ended in a courtroom in Calgary on a gray Tuesday in March, and the person who walked out the winner was the one nobody, including me, ever expected to speak. My name is Russell Whitaker. I'm 54 years old. I run a small carpentry workshop just outside Cochrane, Alberta, and the boy I call my son is named Felix. Felix is 15. He has Asperger's, which sits somewhere on the autism spectrum, and he has eyes the color of weak tea and a memory that I've stopped trying to measure because it makes me feel slow. He is also, apparently, a painter. I say apparently because I still can't quite get my head around the fact that a canvas my boy finished in the corner of our garage last spring sold at a private auction in Toronto for $2.6 million. But that's not where this story starts. This story starts on a Wednesday morning in February, with a phone call from a lawyer I had never heard of, working on behalf of a woman I had spent more than a decade trying not to think about. I was in the kitchen when the phone rang. Felix was at the table eating his oatmeal in the precise way he always eats it, scraping the bowl in concentric circles, never letting one bite touch another until they were already in his mouth. I'd long since stopped finding it strange. It was just how he ate. The kettle was whistling. The radio was playing some CBC morning show I half listened to, and the voice on the other end of the phone was crisp and lawyerly, and asked if I was Mr. Russell Whitaker, and when I said yes, told me his name was Andrew Pemberton, and he represented my former wife, Diane Whitaker. I set the phone down on the counter. I walked over to the window. Outside, snow was sliding off the metal roof of the workshop in slow, heavy slabs. I could see Felix's reflection in the glass. He hadn't looked up from his bowl. He never did when I got phone calls. I picked the phone back up. I said, "Diane hasn't been my wife for 12 years. Mr. Pemberton said very politely that he understood, but that his client had asked him to reach out concerning her son Felix and certain assets that had recently come into Felix's possession. He used the phrase, certain assets, the way some people use the word growth when they mean tumor. I asked what he meant. He said he'd prefer to discuss it in person, and would I be available for a meeting at his office in Calgary the following Monday. I said I would call him back. I hung up. I stood in my kitchen and watched my son eat his oatmeal, and I felt something cold slide down the inside of my chest that had nothing to do with the weather. Because I knew before I'd even put the phone down. She had read about the painting. Of course she had. The story had run in the National Post. Some art reporter had picked it up from a gallery newsletter, and the next thing I knew, our quiet little life in Cochrane had a number attached to it, and that number had 8 figures. And somewhere in Vancouver, where I knew Diane had moved with the man she'd left us for, somebody had handed her a newspaper. 12 years. That was how long she had been gone. Felix had just turned 3 when she walked out the front door of our house in Bragg Creek with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a smaller bag with her makeup and a bottle of perfume she'd already half emptied. He had been sitting on the floor of the living room, building a tower out of wooden blocks. He had stacked them in order of weight, heaviest at the bottom, even though he was 3. She walked past him without touching the top of his head. I remember that detail with a precision that still surprises me. She didn't say goodbye. She told me, in the doorway, that she couldn't do it anymore. She said the word "it" and waved her hand vaguely back into the house, and I understood that it meant Felix. Felix had been diagnosed 8 months earlier. The pediatrician at the Alberta Children's Hospital had been kind and slow and careful with her words. Diane had cried in the parking lot. I had thought, naively, that we were crying together. I learned later that we were crying about completely different things. I was crying because my son was going to need me more than I had ever planned for. She was crying because her son was going to need her more than she had ever planned for. The same fact. 2 different sentences. She tried for about 6 months. I'll give her that, even now. She read the books. She went to the appointments. But by the time Felix was 3, she had stopped meeting my eyes when we passed each other in the hallway, and she had started taking weekend trips to Vancouver to visit a cousin she'd never previously seemed close to. And one Sunday she came home and the cousin's name was Marcus, and he wasn't actually a cousin. And 3 weeks after that, the duffel bag was on her shoulder. I kept the house. I kept the boy. I kept everything, because she didn't want any of it, and the divorce was the cleanest piece of paperwork I have ever signed. She gave up custody on a Tuesday morning in a lawyer's office in downtown Calgary, and she didn't even ask to keep the photo albums. I drove home, picked Felix up from the daycare that had agreed, after I begged them, to keep working with him, and I told him in the car on the way home that it was just going to be the two of us now. He didn't react. I don't think he understood. He kept staring at the way the wipers moved across the windshield, fascinated by the rhythm of it. That was 12 years ago. For the next 12 years, Diane sent nothing. Not a birthday card, not a Christmas present, not a phone call asking how he was doing. She moved to Vancouver with Marcus, then to Kelowna, then I lost track. I heard, second-hand from her sister Margaret, who lived in Red Deer, and who was the only person in Diane's family who ever stayed in touch with us, that Diane and Marcus had gotten married, then divorced, then she had married someone else, a man named Peter who managed a chain of dental clinics in the Lower Mainland. Margaret would send Felix a card every December and a small check on his birthday. I framed one of her cards once. Felix had pointed at it and said, "Aunt Margaret writes her R's funny." That's the kind of thing he notices. I raised him, just me. There were nights, in the early years, when I didn't sleep because Felix didn't sleep, because something in his sensory wiring meant that the sound of the furnace turning on and off was, for several years, more interesting than the concept of nighttime. There were meltdowns at grocery stores. There were teachers who didn't get it and teachers who did, and I remember the names of the second kind better than my own cousins. There was a woman named Miss Danvers in grade 3 who told me Felix was, and I quote, "the most observant student I have ever taught in 26 years," and I cried in my truck in the school parking lot for 15 minutes after that conversation. Felix started painting when he was 9. It started with watercolors, then acrylics. Then by 12 he had moved into oils, working in the corner of my workshop because he liked the smell of the wood and the consistency of the light through the high window. He didn't paint people. He almost never painted people. He painted weather. He painted the inside of forests. He painted the way a single shaft of light moves across a hardwood floor at 4 in the afternoon in October. He had a way of catching the moment just before something happens, and an old friend of mine named Henrik, who had retired from a gallery in Banff, came over one day to look at a piece of furniture I was building, and he stopped in the middle of the workshop and stared at one of Felix's canvases for a full 11 minutes without speaking. I timed it. He turned to me eventually and he said, "Russ, this boy is the real thing." Henrik introduced us to a curator. The curator introduced us to a gallery in Toronto. The gallery sold one of Felix's paintings, a piece he had titled simply January 6, 14 a.m., for $2.6 million to a private collector in Switzerland. The check, after the gallery's commission and the agent's fee and the lawyer's setup fee for the trust account I had immediately put it into, came to just over $2 million. It went into a trust with Felix as the beneficiary, with me as the trustee, with strict provisions about disbursement, education, and care, all set up by a lawyer in Calgary named Teresa Kowalski, whom I trusted with my life. That was in October. Diane's lawyer called in February. I drove down to Calgary on the Monday. Mr. Pemberton's office was on the 17th floor of a glass tower on 4th Avenue, the kind of place where the receptionist offers you sparkling water in a real glass. I declined. I sat in his office. He smiled at me with the careful smile of a man who has been paid to smile, and he slid a manila folder across the desk, and he told me that his client, Mrs. Diane Reinhardt, formerly Whitaker, had become deeply concerned about the welfare of her son. Concerned about his living situation, concerned about the management of the substantial assets in his name, concerned, frankly, about the appropriateness of a father with no formal training in autism care or financial management overseeing the affairs of a vulnerable minor with a multi-million-dollar estate. I let him talk. I sat there in his leather chair, and I watched his mouth move, and I thought about the 3-year-old boy stacking blocks by weight on the living room floor of our old house in Bragg Creek. I thought about every fever I'd nursed, every fluorescent-lit emergency room, every meltdown in every parking lot, every parent-teacher conference where I'd had to explain, again, what my son needed in order to learn. I thought about the 12 years of complete and utter silence from a woman who had now apparently rediscovered her maternal instincts at exactly the same moment that her son had rediscovered her bank balance. I asked him what she wanted. He said his client was seeking, as a first step, joint guardianship, and a transfer of trustee responsibilities to a neutral third party. He used the phrase, best interests of the child 4 times in 2 minutes. He said his client had also instructed him to file a motion alleging that I had isolated Felix from his maternal family, restricted his social development, and made unilateral decisions regarding his medical and educational care that had not been in his best interest. I sat very still. I thanked him for his time. I left. I didn't shout. I didn't throw the manila folder. I walked out of that building and got into my truck and drove the 40 minutes back to Cochrane, and when I walked into the kitchen, Felix was sitting at the table sketching something on a piece of newsprint, and he looked up at me and he said, "Dad, your jaw's doing the thing." The thing, in Felix's vocabulary, meant the thing where I clench my teeth so hard that the muscle on the side of my face stands out like a rope. Felix had been observing my face for 15 years. He could read me better than I could read myself. I sat down across from him. I told him, plainly, the way I had always told him things, that his mother had hired a lawyer and was trying to take some control of him and his money. I didn't dress it up. He didn't like it when people dressed things up. He listened. He set down his pencil. He looked at the table for a long moment. Then he said, "Okay, show me everything." I called Teresa the next morning. She drove out to the house herself, which was the kind of thing she did. She sat at our kitchen table with 3 folders and a yellow legal pad, and she walked us through what was about to happen. She told me, in her quiet, careful way, that this kind of case was difficult to win quickly, but that the facts were strongly in our favor, and that we had documentation, and we had history, and we had Felix's own preferences, which would matter once he was interviewed by the court-appointed assessor. Felix asked if he could see the court documents. Teresa hesitated. She looked at me. I nodded. She handed him the petition. Felix read it. Slowly, the way he reads, which is to say once and forever. He set it down. He said, "She's lying about 6 things. 3 of them are factual. 3 of them are interpretive. Can I keep this copy?" Teresa, to her credit, did not laugh. She said yes. The weeks that followed were the kind of weeks that age you. Diane filed her petition formally. There was a court date set for late March. There was a court-appointed assessor, a kind woman named Dr. Bhatia, who came to the house twice, and spent 4 hours each time with Felix, and observed our routines, and asked me a great many questions about how I had structured his education, his therapy, his social engagement, his nutrition. She left without telling me what she'd write. There were depositions. Diane's lawyer came at me for an entire afternoon with questions designed to make me look isolating, controlling, financially opportunistic. He asked me whether I had ever discouraged Felix from contacting his mother. I said no. He asked me if I had Felix's mother's contact information. I said no. He asked how I could claim not to have discouraged contact when I didn't even possess her contact information. I said because she had never given it to me, and because in 12 years she had not once asked for ours, despite knowing exactly where we lived, in the same house, in Cochrane, that the divorce papers had specified. He moved on. Through all of it, Felix stayed quiet. He went to school. He came home. He painted. He spent hours in the workshop. He started staying up late at night working on something I wasn't allowed to see. I asked him once gently if he was okay. He said, "I'm working on it." I assumed he meant a painting. I was wrong. The court hearing was on a Tuesday in late March. The courtroom in Calgary was small and beige and lit by fluorescent panels that gave everyone's skin a faintly green tint. Diane was there. I hadn't seen her in 12 years. Her hair was different. She was wearing a charcoal suit and small pearl earrings and a wedding ring I didn't recognize. She didn't look at me when I walked in. She didn't look at Felix either. She kept her eyes on her lawyer's notes. Mr. Pemberton stood up first. He talked for nearly an hour. He talked about a mother's love. He talked about a vulnerable young man with significant developmental challenges. He talked about the dangers of having a single parent, with no professional background, managing a multi-million-dollar artistic estate. He said his client was not seeking financial gain, only proper oversight, and was prepared to commit to a transparent third-party trustee. He used the phrase best interests of the child 11 times. I counted. When he finished, Teresa stood up. She was about to begin her opening when Felix, who was sitting next to me, leaned over and whispered something into her ear. She paused. She looked at him. She looked at me. He looked back at both of us calmly, and in his quiet, level voice he said, "Let me handle it." Teresa thought for a long second. Then she addressed the judge. She said her client's son, the subject of the proceeding, who was nearly 16 years of age and fully cognitively competent, had asked to make a statement. She asked the court if Felix could be permitted to address the court directly, with the assessor present. The judge, a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a low bun, looked over at Felix. She said, "Young man, do you want to speak?" Felix said, "Yes, ma'am. I have prepared remarks. 8 minutes. I have a binder." He stood up. He walked to the small lectern. He set down a black 3-ring binder. He opened it. He looked, for the first time, directly at his mother across the room. What followed I will remember until the day I die. Felix laid out in calm chronological order every date his mother had been absent from his life. He had compiled them from public records, from photographs, from social media archives, from court documents from her 2 subsequent marriages. He had a timeline of her addresses. He had every interview she had given in a regional magazine in Kelowna in 2000 and 19 inches, which she had described herself as child-free by choice. He read the relevant sentence aloud, and then closed the binder on that page and moved on. He addressed the 6 factual inaccuracies in her petition one by one. He cited the specific paragraph, and the specific document, and the specific countervailing piece of evidence. He named his pediatrician, his 3 former teachers, his current art instructor, his family doctor, and his speech and language pathologist, and he said he would be willing to provide signed letters from each of them, all of which Teresa, on cue, presented to the bailiff. He addressed the question of his autism directly. He said that he understood that the petition described him as vulnerable. He said vulnerability was not the same as incapacity. He said his diagnosis affected the way he processed information, not whether he could process it. He said he had been managing his own daily routines, his own academic planning, and most of his own social negotiations for several years. He said he was aware of the value of the trust, and was satisfied with how it was being managed, and with whom was managing it. He looked at his mother. He didn't look at me. He said, "And this is the part I will carry to my grave. I do not know you. I do not have any memory of you. The man sitting at that table raised me. He is the only parent I have ever had. I am asking the court to recognize that, and I am asking you, ma'am, to please leave us alone." The courtroom was so silent I could hear the hum of the lights overhead. Diane started to cry. I think for the first time in this whole thing I believed her tears. But it didn't matter, because the woman she had needed to be in order for those tears to count had stopped existing 12 years ago in the doorway of our house in Bragg Creek. The judge closed her folder. She did not deliberate long. She denied the petition in its entirety. She ordered Mrs. Reinhardt to pay our legal costs. She made a note, on the record, commending Felix for what she called an act of self-advocacy that this court rarely sees from individuals 3 times your age. We walked out. Teresa hugged Felix in the hallway, which surprised me, because Teresa is not a hugger, and surprised Felix, who is not a hugger, but he allowed it briefly, the way he sometimes allows the cat to sit on his lap when he is reading. Diane was already gone by the time we reached the lobby. I never saw her again. We drove back to Cochrane in silence. I asked Felix eventually, "How long did it take you to put that binder together?" He said, 6 weeks. I started the night Teresa came over. I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" He said, "Because you would have told me I didn't need to, and I needed to." We stopped at the diner on Highway 1A on the way home, the way we always do. He ordered a grilled cheese. I ordered the soup. He drew on the placemat with the broken end of a crayon. I want to say something to anyone listening who has a child in their life who sees the world differently. Don't underestimate them, not for a single day. The things they notice, the things they hold, the things they understand without being told are gifts the rest of us simply do not have. My son built a defense in 6 weeks that 2 senior lawyers couldn't break in 3 hours. He did it because the world had, for 15 years, given him 1,000 quiet reasons to learn that nobody else was going to speak for him unless he chose to speak first. And to anyone out there raising a child alone, especially a child the world has marked as different, I want to say this. The work you are doing matters. It will not always look like it matters. It will sometimes look like nothing at all. It will look like another bowl of oatmeal at 6 in the morning, Another fluorescent lit waiting room. Another parent-teacher conference where you have to explain, one more time, what your child needs. But it adds up. The years stack like blocks. And one day, if you are lucky, the child you have spent your life showing up for will turn around and show up for you, and you will understand, finally, that love is not a feeling. Love is just attendance. It is the act of being there, again and again and again, until the showing up is the whole shape of the thing. Felix is 16 next month. He is working on a new series. He won't tell me what it's about. He says I'll see when it's ready. I'll be here. I'm always here. That's the whole job.